So this is a 1988 Bertone X19, which is red in colour. There was only 21 of these delivered to Australia in red, so they're quite rare. It has the matching engine lid, the rear wing, the dial wheels, as well as the side protectors for the doors. It also came factory with a passenger mirror. This is very different because the right-hand drive passenger mirror has a slightly different angle than just buying one from the US. Australia got the last of the right-hand drive fuel injection models, and they drive really well, they start really quick, and they're quite a smooth ride. It also came with power windows. This is actually a one-owner car and has been used as a daily driver up to recently. It's having quite a few issues. Just pushing it into the garage was really difficult because the brakes were locked on. There's oil absolutely everywhere, all over the sump and all over the gearbox. It's absolutely covered. I also noticed the lower engine mount is also gone. Being such an original car, it still had all its covers, so I'm going to remove them and then start degreasing. So while I let the degreaser soak in, I'm going to take a look at the wheels. Giving the front wheel a spin, you can see it's almost completely locked on. I'm going to remove the brake fluid because it looks like it's all being cooked. There's some deep grooves in the disc, and the pad is not making full contact with the disc as well. There's also a little bit of pad still stuck to the disc. The disc itself is quite thick but will get replaced. The passenger side is also pretty grooved. Disconnecting the hose for the caliper and then removing the caliper itself. It just wouldn't budge. I pulled out the old trusty screwdriver and pulled it off, and you can see it's just in pieces inside there. It's not looking good. Removing the pads, you can see they're breaking apart in my hand. And again, the same problem on the passenger side. I'm taking a closer look at the calipers to see what condition they're in. The brake oil inside the calipers was basically black. The piston wouldn't move under pressure, so I had to give it some encouragement. After disassembling and degreasing, I decided it would be easier just to go with the ones I prepared earlier. These ones were vapor blasted. So now just to reassemble them with all new seals. And then install a new set of discs. I'm using these former Italian-made pads. I find them quite good for road use. The brake reservoir now has fresh oil, and I'm using the vacuum bleeder to suck through any old oil. I think the colour of the oil says it all. So the front brakes are now complete with new pads, a new disc, rebuilt calipers and new brake hoses. And then just to re-bleed the front brakes. And what a difference that made. So now for the back brakes. They're not too bad as far as thickness goes, but they do have some pretty bad grooves on it, so I'm going to replace them anyway. The rear caliper seemed okay. I took it off and just cleaned it up a bit and noticed there was a little cut in the dust cover, so I replaced it with a new one. The pads on the other hand were definitely end of life. They were only 7.5 and the brand new ones are 10. So all I needed to do here was the disc, pads and new brake hose. So next is the cooling system. I'm using some penetrating oil there on the bolts so I can remove the water from the car. I'm also making sure to drain all the water out of the block. There really wasn't enough water in the car and the coolant was pretty much non-existent. So now just to wipe off any oil with a rag because I'm going to replace the gearbox oil first. Undoing the top plug first, there was no oil dripping out at all. Removing the stinking oil from the gearbox and then seeing small fragments of metal on the magnet, which was probably part of third gear. It takes about 3.5 litres of gearbox oil, and I just keep putting it in until it starts dripping out like that. So I wanted to take the car for a test drive, and I noticed that the expansion tank middle part that holds it together is cracked and broken. I then noticed all the coolant on the ground, and then I realized it was leaking from the pump. There was clearly no point in taking it for a test drive, so I drained the car once again. So time to take off the rest of these covers and take a closer look at what's going on. This belt needs replacing and there's oil everywhere. So I'm going to disconnect the alternator and the pump because the alternator is also playing up. As this is a later series car, there is an access panel from the rear boot to the engine bay. It's a little bit time consuming to remove everything, but the rear axis is so much better. And you can see how much better the axis is from the back. That's the water pump. I'm going to remove the alternator and replace the regulator, as well as check the bearing, just to undo all the wires and unbolt it from the car. This regulator was replaced before because this one's made in Australia. And the brushes are worn as expected. The bearing itself seems quite good. So now with the alternator out of the way, you can see the leak is coming directly from the seal on the pump. It also looks like it's leaking from here as well. I decided to remove the entire water pump housing and have a closer look. And that's disconnecting the hose from the thermostat housing. So with everything disconnected, I can now drop the housing down. With it removed from the car, I can really see how bad this pump is. And on the block side could also do with a clean as well. Now to remove the pipe from the housing. And look at the crud inside there. I'm cleaning it off with some Scotch-Brite and a wire brush attached to a drill. Then cleaning off the mating surfaces. Now to disconnect the pump from the housing. I'm whacking it with a hammer because it's not going to be used again. Take a look at this impeller, there's almost something growing on it. I have a brand new pump and I have a second-hand housing that's been vapor blasted. In order for the pump to work properly, the impeller has to be close to the housing like this, not like this. There's a massive gap. With all the debris on the impeller, it's grooved lines into the housing, which makes the pump work even worse, where this one is completely smooth. So now that I have the pump and alternator removed, I can continue degreasing. The reason there's so much oil on the engine is the oil cap was missing for some time and it was driven, and the oil came out and went all over the engine but was never cleaned. The timing belt cover is made of two pieces. There's one with 3 bolts at the top and 1 bolt at the bottom. I expected to see a lot of oil on there, but there's nothing at all. It actually looks quite good. It was last changed in 2017, so it's probably worth changing now anyway. Seeing I have the water removed and the pump removed, I may as well take the radiator out and give it a good flush. With fresh water being pumped into the input, I'm shaking the radiator and dirt is coming out. Washing out the external fins and then putting the radiator back in place. The degreaser has had time to soak in and the high pressure hose makes it easy work to get it off. And that's looking so much better and much easier to work on now. So now cleaning off the surface where the new pump housing will need to reconnect. Now that I've reassembled the pump, I'm putting it back into place. I'm going to be using a paper gasket, but there are other options out there as well. With it now securely in place, I'll attach the alternator bracket. I'm now going to replace the timing belt as it's 6 years old. With a closer inspection of the belt, it looks fine, there's no oil on it, but it's going to get replaced regardless. The tensioner bearing seems fine and was replaced in 2017 and hasn't done many kilometers. I did have a spare ready to go, but this just doesn't seem worth replacing. And with the belt out of the way, I can do a little bit more cleaning. And now to just put in the replacement belt. Putting the pulley wheel back on with its new V-belt as well. I've now received the replacement regulator, which will now screw directly into this alternator. And now it's all cleaned up and put back in place. Now to reattach all the wiring. Reattach the hoses for the water pump and then fill it with water to see if we have any leaks. And so far so good, I don't see any leaks coming from under the car. I'm replacing the spark plugs because I don't really know how old they are. And now to adjust the timing. The cap and the rotor button looked okay. With all the cleaning, the oil's made its way onto the manifold, so it's getting hot but burning off. I also noticed the top of the expansion tank was moving, so that couldn't be much good either. I don't seem to have any leaks, so I'm going to run this radiator flush through the system to clean it out. making sure there's no air pockets in the radiator by opening this tap. This car did have an intermittent problem where it would randomly just stop and then not start and then start again after a while. It was actually quite a simple fix. The wire to the coil was just loose, so all I needed to do was tighten it. I put the car back on the hoist to check for any leaks, and I don't see any oil leaks and I don't see any water leaks. So I'm draining the oil out and the cooling system once again. Now to grease up the new filter, fill it and then put it in place. I need to replace the lower engine mount, but on the Bertonis they had a slightly different engine mounting bracket. The problem is you just can't buy them anymore. You can buy the early model mount, but you can't get the bit with the bracket on the back. There was these aftermarket ones you could buy that would bolt on, but I can't find them anymore, so I need to either get them remade or find out who supplied them. For reference, this is what it looks like with the bracket on another car. I need to undo these two bolts to remove the expansion tank. Lucky they're easy to get to from the back boot. Then just one bolt on the top. Then undo the top and bottom hoses. The stainless steel tanks were used on a Series 1, these were used on all other series. They're a better model because they don't actually crack or break. These stainless steel tanks will just bolt straight into place in replacement to the plastic ones, however they are getting quite hard to find. The access plate can now go back in as I won't need to do any further timing. In goes the original spare wheel, and then the timing belt cover. And now to fill it up with some fresh oil. For coolant I'm using 50-50, half coolant and half demineralized water. With the cap removed from the expansion tank you can see the pump is working well. The fuel injection models had this cooling fan which was located in the back boot. It basically blew cold air over the manifold when the car stopped. For some reason it was disconnected on this car. So now to reassemble the back boot. A couple of screws hold the plate in place. This insulation goes just above the exhaust, and then this metal plate goes above that. Just 4 screws hold that in place. Installing the rear insulation and then the back mat. Then to screw it in place, but that's it. Now to put all the other engine covers back in place. Unfortunately, at the time of filming I didn't have the new air filter, but it will be replaced. The back of the Targa on the passenger side keeps bouncing up and down. The driver's side is fine. The rubber part that fits into the driver's side is fine, but you can see the passenger one is missing a piece at the end. There is some adjustment you can do here. By loosening those screws you can actually move that plate back and forth. The plate is now set further back. Latching the roof back on, you can see there's little to no movement now. I'm lubricating the rubber with a little bit of silicone to stop any squeaks. Now to torque up the bolts and check the air pressure, and then put on some new wheel caps. Now to replace the radio as it wasn't working properly. I'm actually not surprised, look at this mess of wires. Taking all the electrical tape I could see the crime that was committed. There was no back speakers even connected and things were just kind of slotted in place and just stuck with tape. Untangling everything, this is what's actually left. I have the front speakers which are joined together like mono, the rear speakers plus power, the electric antenna, and the on-off power. So what I've made is a converter that connects to the original loom and then will reconnect itself to a modern connector from the old connector. So a little bit of soldering and crimping and I should be done. I'm using this socket connector so I can separate the front speakers back into stereo. So that's now fixed, everything is now on sockets, the spare wires are not used on this radio, but it converts the old system to the new system. The hole for the radio is a little bit too big, so I'm going to have to modify one of the plates to make it fit properly. I'm cutting the original plate so the radio will fit inside here perfectly. Now to slip it in and secure it in place. The antenna cable is so short that it doesn't actually reach the back of the radio, so I've had to put my hand through the glove box and then feed it into the back of the radio. This head unit has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto all in a 1-DIN configuration. As it's using Apple CarPlay, you get all the features including navigation. The sun visors were a little loose, just tightening up 2 screws will hold it in place. I'm now going for my very first test drive, as well as bedding in the brakes. I'm just going up to about 60 kilometers an hour and then slowing down to 30 and repeating this process over and over and going around the block. The next day I took the car out for another test drive and did some emergency brake testing for a bit of fun. And of course, the car would not be complete unless it had an X19 Australia sticker. Parts came to 2,533, hoist time was 1,320, bringing a total of 3,853. If you're interested in becoming a member of X19 Australia, please visit club.x19.com.au. For those of you that own a different Italian car, please visit fiatclub.net.au.